thinking to yourself, what do I need to look at this for? I know what has to be done. I know what the role of a pastor is. Well, it's interesting that this comes exactly after what we've spoken of about the role of women in the church. He now looks at the framework of the church and its leadership. And the question asks, what do pastors do? What do they do? What do you think they do? You're smiling. Well, I expand God's word, but you'd be surprised of how many people have got no idea what pastors do. They have an idea of what they think they should do, but most don't really know what a pastor does. And many would say, well, give me, what's the pastor's job description? And I'm interested to know, what do you think the job description for a pastor is? What do you expect from him? Shepherd? Yep. Preaching? Teaching? You see, a pastor wears many hats, not just one. And particularly in small churches, he wears a multitude of hats. Now, in a big mega church, he might have a number of pastors, and he might be the senior pastor. He's able to delegate. But we need to be able to go back and say, well, what does the Bible have to say about the description of a pastor? And it tells us that we've got a biblical model that will help us to understand the role and the function of a pastor. Now, sadly, and I've seen it over the years, the church has moved away from the biblical model of what a pastor should do and a pastor is. And I was exposed to this when I did the higher academic studies. I was exposed to it because we looked at the roles and responsibilities of pastors and what they should do. And what is being taught in a lot of seminaries is that the pastor is a CEO of a company. That's what's being taught, that you're a CEO of a company. Now, when I think of the CEO of a company, I think of the Microsoft bloke. I think of the bloke that's in charge of Amazon and that. And what is the impression that you get of these guys? They're high flyers. They make significant impacts. Now, is this the job of a pastor, to be CEO of a company? You see, when the pastor is viewed as a CEO or of a corporation, organisation, and then he models his leadership role on that of a corporate officer, then what you see is no different in leadership from what you'd expect outside from a corporate CEO. And many churches are run like businesses. It's called the profit and loss margin. It's called, this is the CEO, this is the deputy, this is those under them, and then you've got meetings between them, and the church now has become a business model. And I can understand why. But what it does, as I look at it, it cultivates, if you like, a culture where people are very dependent on the pastor to meet their needs rather than the Lord himself. If you've got a CEO who's the boss and fires and everything else and can do magical things, that's who you depend on. Your dependence is not going to be on the Lord or what he has to say in his word. And so I believe it's the right time for us to have a look at the biblical role about what pastors do and don't do. And the first thing I want to do is clarify the role of a pastor by the use of terms. And we're going to find that here. When you read the New Testament, you come across different words. And those different words all describe the office and function of an office of pastor. And those terms are as follows. An elder. An elder is basically a pastor. It's a person who speaks of his wisdom and maturity. You also have the word bishop. Now, when you think of a bishop, what do you think of? No, don't tell me. But the bishop, when it uses the term bishop, it's referring to the office of a pastor as well. It speaks of his office as an overseer of the church. That's what a bishop is, overseer of the church. That's what a pastor is. He oversees the work of the church. And of course, you've got the pastor, and this word speaks of the preacher's responsibility to care for the flock and lead them in the Lord's will. You'll come across another term, preacher. This speaks of his duty, and that duty is to boldly declare the whole counsel of God, all of it, not just the bits and pieces he likes, but every part of it. You have the term teacher, which reminds us that the pastor is to instruct those who are under his leadership. He's to teach them, constantly be teaching them. There's the word servant. It speaks of the fact that the pastor is not above his people, but he devotes his life to ministering to the needs of others. He puts the needs of others before that of himself. So the CEO, does the CEO do that? Not if you're running a corporate organisation. Then we have a steward. This word reminds us that the pastor is in the business of caring for the property of another. In other words, he's caring for the flock of God. They're not his flock. They're the flock of God, and he is answerable to them. So he's a servant of God. All those terms clarify the one office of what a pastor is and what a pastor does. So when you read these terms, elder, bishop, pastor, preacher, teacher, servant, steward, and even presbyteros, which is presbytery, it's referring to that office of a pastor. So, and all these terminologies clarify that the role of a pastor, what it is, and they let us know it's not an ordinary job. But it does have a great deal to say about those men who are called to this role and responsibility. The Bible has a lot to say. And the very first thing I want to make plain is this. The pastor's call in 1 Timothy chapter 1. And it says, what I say is true. Anyone wanting to become an overseer desires a good work. The call of a man to the ministry in the role of a pastor is something that's not to be taken lightly. It's a very serious and it's a very important call. God calls certain people. And this call is limited. And I say it's limited. As I've gone through last week to make it plain that God calls men to take the responsibility for leadership in the church, I believe that this position is limited to men. It says if a man aspires. In the original language, all the way down to verse 6, it uses the masculine form, making it clear that it's calling for men only. Now, I know that there's a lot of gymnastics that are used to apply, but the original language uses the masculine form all the way down. It clearly states it's the gender of men. This is who are called, not women, not because they can't, they can't according to the Bible, but it's not their job or responsibility. It's not their function. And we talked about that last week. So this call is limited to godly men only. And God is looking for godly men to take up the role of this calling to be a pastor. You'll notice it says, if any man aspires, any man desires, it's a fine work. Now the first word we use in the Greek is origo, and it means to stretch oneself, to grab hold of something. This is the idea of that word aspire, to stretch oneself to grab hold of something. The other word he uses is epithumia, and it's used to describe a passionate desire. And these are the words to give the concept. If anyone desires to stretch themselves and grab hold of this office with a passion, then it's a good thing. That's what it's saying. That's why it should be taken seriously. It describes men who have got a passionate desire to stretch themselves. It's something that drives them on. Now understand this. The desire is not for the office. The desire is not for the place. The desire is not for the position. The desire is not for the title. It's a desire for the work of that office. There's a difference. There are many who fill the positions of pastors who don't have the right motivation for being in that office. They want the title, they want the position, they want the prestige. But you know what? They don't want the work. Yet Paul says he desires a fine work, a good work. So those who aspire to be a pastor that God calls and has this passion to stretch themselves, it is in the work of a pastor. It's the work of a pastor. Now, our text says that any man who desires this office of overseer or bishop, the word used is episkopos, meaning one who looks over. It's describing a spiritual leader, a pastor, a shepherd, who understands it's a responsible calling where that person will be held accountable for the oversight of the church of God. They recognize they're responsible, they're accountable for the ministry they do. Overseers have the responsibility of preaching, teaching, administration, pastoral care, using authority to discipline when required, and it includes a general shepherding over the flock of God's people. So he has to be multi-skilled. Multi-skilled. That's why I say wears many hats. It's classified as a good work. And in the Greek, kalu means an honourable and excellent work. In other words, it's a good thing to do. A good thing. It's about the work of shepherding the flock. And if you're called to be the shepherd of a flock, it's a lifelong commitment. It's not a contract for 6 months, which, when we take the model of a CEO, they enter into a contract. That contract says you'll be there for the next 5 years or the next 10 years. And because you signed that contract, you will then receive the benefits of superannuation, taxation, you name it, all the things are laid out. Now that means that you can be terminated. It means that you can put your resignation in if you don't think that you're getting a fair go according to your contract. Well, a shepherd or a pastor has a lifelong commitment to the work, and it's not based on a contract, it's not based on conditions. It's not about an honoured position, it's about the work and function that that person has been called to in that office. And so it's a demanding work that is asked by everyone who's called to fill this position. I will say it's not an easy work, it's a demanding work. It demands time, it demands attention, it demands energy, it demands sacrifice. And if you're not willing to do that, then don't do it, because it's more than a job. And Paul makes this very plain, it's all about the work. It's not about the status, the title, or the prestige of the office. It's not about having a position of authority and reputation. It's a desire for the work of the ministry. That is the priority here in verse 1. So you've got the pastor's call. Then you've got, we had that one. I should have put that up before. The pastor's character. What is he like? And this has been given so that the church understands when you call a man to do the work of the ministry, to take the oversight of the church, there's certain things about a person who's applying for that job that the church needs to be aware of. And it's more than just being a CEO and having a business degree and being able to run a profit or loss or hire and fire or get people to work. Much more than that. In this verse, and I put it up so that you can follow, an overseer must not give people a reason to criticize him. He must only have, what does it say? One wife. Well, why would he have many wives? One wife is enough. He must be self-controlled, wise, respected by others, ready to welcome guests and able to teach. That's what the scriptures lay out the very first thing. Now, if I give you some of these definitions, it means he must be blameless. Now, that word blameless doesn't mean sinless. There's no way that you'll find a pastor who's sinless. He's not perfect. But the Greek word is ana epilepton, and it means that the pastor must be above reproach. This characteristic is not talking about sinlessness. It means that his life is consistent with the message that he preaches. In other words, he lives what he says. He doesn't give an opportunity for anyone to tear down his ministry. His life is balanced. What he says, he puts into practice. So he's above reproach. He can't be criticized. Now, the husband of one wife, I think, speaks for itself. But no man who fills this position can have a multitude of wives. If they did, it rules them out of qualifying for this office. The thinking is this extends to those who have been married, then divorced and remarried as well. Now, that's something for our people to think about, because often we say, oh yeah, the Lord forgives, so basically they can be married, then divorced and remarried and be in that position. But the reason behind this and why the pastor is held to a higher standard is it asks the question, how can a pastor who cannot control his own marriage counsel those who come to him for help with their own marriages if he's failed himself? And it's a legitimate question. Then there's that idea of being self-controlled, or the other Greek is sober. And that word in the Greek is nepthalion. The pastor must possess a serious attitude. In other words, he has to be serious about the work he's undertaking. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a sense of humour. It doesn't mean that at all. But it means he doesn't act in a way that cheapens the message that he brings. In other words, you've seen it, you've probably heard of it, of a minister who's always cracking jokes and bringing the message into disrepute, because it's more about him and what he says rather than the message that he brings. He's to be serious about the business of preaching and teaching the gospel, not cheapening it with his own additions. Now, it uses the next word, self-control, sophronoa, and it means to be temperate. The pastor must be a person who can control himself. It means he is in control of himself. And the term is used to signify the clear-headedness. That's the idea, the clear-headedness that is found in individuals who are qualified to be elders, overseers and leaders in our homes and our churches. In other words, these people must have a clear insight and understanding of a number of things. Respectable, kosmion. This refers, he must have an orderly life. The pastor must be a man who has his life in order. That means he's teaching, he's preaching, he's well prepared, he's well ordered in the way that he does things. Hospitality, philoxion, one who loves the stranger. In other words, the pastor must have an open door policy. And by that I mean, with the people in his own church as well as those outside. You need to know that the pastor will receive them and will reach out to them in Christian love. It also says he must have the ability to teach. Didakrion. The pastor must be a man of the book, a man of the word, a student of the book. In other words, he's able to apply and explain the message of the Word of God to those who are there as they listen. In other words, he makes plain what the Word of God says. Now, that's just in the verse 2. Should I stop there? Not yet. But it goes on. 1 Timothy 3:3, he must not drink too much wine or like to fight, but rather be gentle, peaceable, and not loving money. Now, I put this in a modern translation because it just says it simply. Not given to wine. In other words, not addicted to wine. Parionion, someone who exercises temperance or abstinence from any kind of alcohol. In other words, it's the same word that used a person who's a clear-headed thinker, someone who's never drunk. Now, it asks a question, what about this addiction to wine? In the Greek, it uses a compound word from para, to come alongside, and oinos, wine. In other words, one thing that an elder must not be that would disqualify him is that he's known for being near his wine. He's known for being near his wine. It gives you the old King James version of a person he can't go very far from his wine. His reputation is such that the whole community knows he has an indulgence for wine. Now, I've known of a few people here in Darwin, ministers, who have known for their, just a little bit here or a little bit there, but they're known outside of their churches for a little bit of this. But the real issue is, am I known for my love of wine? Is that what that's all they know about me? That I love a drop here and there. You will not find anywhere in scriptures where we are encouraged to enjoy drunkenness. It's quite the opposite. The Bible has a lot to say about drunkenness. If a pastor or elder has an occasional glass of wine with his meal, it doesn't disqualify him from being a pastor. It does become a different story if he's known throughout the community as someone who's constantly in an inebriated state. It indicates there's a problem. Then people would automatically say, oh, but pastor, what about 1 Timothy 5:23? Does anyone remember what 1 Timothy 5:23 is about? Okay, Paul advises Timothy, pastor, have a little wine for your stomach's sake. So there's the justification. He's not against alcohol. He's saying it's all right every now and again. Isn't that what that says? Isn't that what it's implying? Well, let's look at what the verse is actually saying. Because Paul is not saying, Timothy, I want you to be a good example of moderate drinking. So I want you to start drinking wine with all your meals to demonstrate it's a good and excellent and right thing to do. That's not what he's saying. He's saying instead that he would recommend it for strictly medicinal purposes. He says, since you are having stomach issues, don't just drink water, mix it with a little wine. That's the idea behind it. And Paul is saying, Timothy, your stomach's bothering you. Have a little wine mixed with water. It might make you feel a little better for medicinal purposes. It's true that wine is not forbidden in the Scriptures. But there's no passage in Scriptures that says enjoy wine and the liberty of wine because that's your right to do so. Nowhere does it say that. The scriptural man would not take such things as a right. He would follow the example of Timothy and abstain, if necessary, for the sake of those he ministers to. He doesn't want to become a stumbling block to them. Then it seems strange that he would use the next term, no striker. Others say, not a brawler. And the word used is plakitis, and it has the idea of being pugnacious, a striker. It talks about an individual that is so driven by anger and rage that he would go to blows, that he would throw a punch. And what Paul is saying here, it's inappropriate for the man of God to be known as a brawler and a fighter. Rather, he should be known for his gentleness, epikeus, meaning to be patient and gracious. As an overseer, he's not given to anger to the point of physical violence. Instead, he's a man of gentleness. The concept of having a forbearing spirit because the Lord is near. You want to be gentle. You want to be gracious to all people. In other words, a spiritual leader must have a gracious heart towards others, not an attitude of judgment, not an attitude of attack or unnecessary defensiveness. He is not to be an angry sort of person that would come to blows. Rather than that, he should be the opposite. He's to be peaceful. And it uses the word amicus, meaning literally not to be contentious or a bickerer. The idea here is that this man is not to have a quarrelsome nature. In other words, he doesn't necessarily pick a fight with his fists, but he'll pick a fight with words. He'll provoke, he'll push, he'll be quarrelsome. The man of God does not look for an argument. It means that when someone says something, you don't stand over him in a threatening manner. If the individual that becomes quarrelsome and actively bickers to the point of physical violence, that's not what you want. A better translation is not to be contentious. Not to be contentious. You should be kind, able to teach, patient when wrong, and with gentleness correcting. Why? Because in the end, it is whether God would be gracious enough to save that individual, to work such a truth into that individual's life. And he doesn't need you to be threatening. He doesn't need you to be argumentative. He doesn't need you to be contentious with that man. You tell the truth and you let God do his work. The best thing a pastor can learn at the very beginning of his ministry is to understand you don't have the power to change anybody. You don't. The more you try and change people, the more you find you can't. It's like bashing your head against that brick wall. You can't get that brick wall to change. It's not going to. Only the Lord can change them. Now he uses another word, not greedy of filthy lucre. And he uses an interesting word, aphilagoris. The pastor must not use the ministry as a means of increasing his wealth. He must be free from the love of money. It's a compound word, this word. It means philos, a man that loves, the love of, and arguros, which means loot or money. So you put them together, and it's the idea of a person who loves money. Just loves money. So when you think about the situation that Paul is dealing with and Timothy's facing, is that you had false leaders in the church that had this love for making money. They were working for material gain in their positions of leadership in the church. So what he's saying is becoming an elder is not something you do for financial gain. This is not saying that you are not to be, it's not saying you're to be free from money, because that's not possible in our day and age in which we live. The whole point is, do you love money? Is that your primary motivation? That you do it for the love of the money that you'll get. And the love of money is a constant temptation for all. Yet the reputation of God's man needs to be free from such love. He is not bound to things of money or the pursuit of material things. It doesn't mean he doesn't have them or can't have them. It just means that he needs to be careful that he's not loving these things more than he loves the ministry. He must have the right motivations. In other words, a person who fulfills this position, his heart must be free from desiring them more than spiritual things. That's where Paul was saying, he who desires this is a good thing for the work, not the position, not the function, but for the work. And we'll leave it there. There's still much more about the characteristics and model that's required of a person who fulfills this role of a pastor. But I want us to see that basically, if a pastor is a CEO, then he'll be paid accordingly with all the benefits and perks, isn't it? Yet, what does our scriptures tell us? The qualifications here, the role model is very different from the corporate model. And yet, in seminaries, these are the leadership models that are being presented for future pastors to put out. And we wonder why the church is failing. We need to have a biblical model. And that's why we spend the time. What does the Bible say? Because the Bible is our authority, and it gives us the information and understanding, even the roles and functions of a pastor, and we need to pay attention. As we close, we're going to turn to